Hi, folks. Let's get started. I think I'm seeing a lot of folks here in the chat from all over the country. I'm seeing some folks from Memphis at Promise Development Corps. I'm seeing folks from New Orleans. I'm seeing, wow, a lot. Oh, I see some folks from DC, Minnesota. It's great to see so many of our Spark partners and our Spark family members here. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Y'all can continue doing intros in the chat. As mentioned, please continue dropping your name, pronouns, city, and org. I see a question. We absolutely will be sharing a recording. And go ahead. We have a short poll that's going to just help us get into a little bit of what we would love to hear and share some information across all of this. I went ahead and shared it in the chat, but it's also here on this slide. As mentioned on the slide, we would love any questions or comments in the chat box. We'll bring that into the Q&A at the end of the session, but we'll be tracking them. And so please feel free to just add them there. And if you weren't able to join us for our Demystifying Federal Funding session, that's available on our Spark Hub platform, and we'd be happy to share the recording. And so I'd love to maybe welcome our speakers as folks are filling out the Mentimeter poll. I'm going to go ahead and drop that in the chat right here. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome Sasha Forbes from the Natural Resources Defense Council. She's going to be doing our facilitation for today. Our graphic recorder, Rio Holiday. And just as a note for folks, the best way to go ahead and see if you'd like to see her live recording as we go, you can actually have it in side-by-side gallery, and that way, and I would hit on don't show non-video participants on, and that way you'll be able to kind of focus on her illustration along with the speaker. And then a big welcome to Roberto Garcia-Ceballos and Susan Hartman, Melissa Jones, Mia Madison, and Roberto Requejo, some of our Spark family and our Spark partners. I'm going to go ahead and put up the Mentimeter poll, and I'm going to drop the link in the chat one more time so folks can try filling that out. All right, so I'm going to take myself off mute to say this is just a look at the organizations that we have here with us today. I'm seeing a ton of community-based organizations, local, regional nonprofits, some national nonprofits and intermediaries. Ooh, look at that CBO just jumping. We've got state and federal government, local and regional, philanthropic, a lot of folks here today from a lot of different audiences. I'm going to move us to, well, let's give it a one more minute because I think it'd be cool to see kind of the span of who we've got. And I'm going to go ahead and also just spotlight Rio so you can go ahead and see the work that she's all doing. And I'm going to move us to the next slide. Ooh, wow. All right. A lot of jumps. Okay. And folks, the link to this should be in the chat. And I'll just drop it in the chat one more time if you're trying to fill this out, but have in a minute. And yep, I see that note in the chat. We will also be sharing this out after the session along with the illustrations as well. I think some folks are filled out, but this is really, I think, where we are. We've got quite a lot of responses here. I'm going to move us into the last slide. Compliance, reporting compliance, reporting a lot, handling the administrative burdens, time, energy, cost to administer, keeping up with reporting, accessibility for low-income and communities of color, staff capacity, availability. Federal funding is 100% not going to be accessible to CBOs or nonprofits. All right, we have indirect cost. I'm seeing reporting across the board. It looks like here reporting compliance, lack of capacity for state and local groups representing impacted communities. Getting funds to low-income and BIPOC communities most in need. And not being able to advocate as boldly or independently. Okay, we'll give this 1 or 2 more minutes. I think we have over 45, 50 folks who have been able to respond to this last question. I see that number going up. Okay, I think we're gonna be able to view this afterwards, and I think some folks may want to add to this during the session. Maybe if new pieces come up that you're like, and you know what, that may be a concern as well, you can go ahead and add this. We'll be looking at this after the session as well, and as mentioned, we'll share this out. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead. A reminder that Rio is going to be live illustrating, so we're going to have her highlighted, but you can pin her on your screen, and it's best to be in speaker gallery mode so that you can go ahead and pin her screen.
Jasmine, you could move ahead. Sorry, I didn't realize the slides weren't going. Yeah. So this is the second webinar in our federal funding and use series, and the series is intended to help us all, but primarily help communities to better understand federal funding and the distinctions and the realities around federal funding, provide an opportunity to think about funding more broadly, and potential funding, infrastructure funding programs, especially with the infrastructure bill, position organizations to be stronger, and then, of course, just share best practices to transform the current funding system and to learn about strategies that are working in different regions, especially given the range of issues that was just mentioned on the Mentimeter and the poll earlier. So next slide. On the last webinar, we focused on breaking down the flow of funding from the congressional level to the local level, right? What happens before it goes to states and local governments, different points of influence and decision-making. For example, the role of the state government in influencing spending rules and dispersing funds. And the speakers also highlighted spending from the infrastructure bill, which has majority of the funds going to transportation, but then also sharing that funds might be available in parts of the bill that you might not think about. For example, looking to the Department of Energy and looking there for programs related to housing, even though clearly we would have funds for energy efficiency, but just looking in unexpected places. Next slide. We also wanted to share that funding flows to communities in different ways. So you have money that starts at the federal level, and then it trickles down to different decision makers. So there's different points that people can enter into the application process. For example, on the federal level, you might apply to an agency like HUD or DOT or EPA for competitive grants. Or maybe on the state level, you could apply for grants as well. And so what we have in this slide, and we're also, again, going to be sharing this slide and also doing some more visual flow charts, we have a representation of how the Community Development Block Grant, or the CDBG, flows into communities, because that's one direct point where you don't necessarily you don't apply on the federal level for CDBG, you apply locally depending on eligibility and partnerships and all of that. And so if you missed the last webinar, please, go back. We have the recording. We have all of the materials that's available just to help you think about just the first part about where funding can be located, and the breakdown of all funding. Not all, but, federal to local. So next slide. As a foundation for today, what I wanted to do is share a couple of things. One of them is the different characteristics about what we mean when we talk about community-based organization, because as we were having this conversation, we realized that people were saying and thinking about different things, but specifically from our perspective, we were talking about groups that are community serving and centered, and they serve as community connectors. These are frontline, grassroots organizations, nonprofits. A lot of the groups are small, typically maybe having fewer than 10 staff, but we know on average that might be 3 or 4, or you might be a shop of 1 or 2 staff. And then we also have community-based organizations that are mid-sized and really serving the role of a community connector. They represent a variety of issues, often led by people of color. And so we want to definitely be able to center that, because most of the funding is definitely not going to Black and Brown Indigenous groups at this time. And then groups also operate under a variety of different functions. So you have nonprofit advocacy, policy organizing, social services, community development, and a host of other issues that community-based organizations are really holding down. Next slide. So as I kind of wrap up the beginning component of this, I wanted to share that we are working in a funding ecosystem that ultimately was not set up to support small or even frontline grassroots and Black and brown-led organizations. And so as we share and we break things down, it's with the knowledge that funding and grant administration system, it needs transformation. And the groups might be working locally to change that while also aligning themselves to receive funding. So there's the dual role and the pressure that's often placed on community-based organizations to position for funds when the system that the groups are positioning themselves to need to be fixed or completely changed. So our presentation and this series is with that knowledge that there isn't one magic way, but there are a variety of tools and information that we can equip ourselves with to really help maneuver and use information from the different regions, because the federal funding is flowing and it's continuing to come to communities. So we really want to center the wisdom of community to get there and best position to apply for these resources, and also change how it comes into the communities in the process. So with that said, I want to introduce Susan Hartman, who is with Enterprise Advisors, and Susan and Enterprise Advisors recently worked on a paper on increasing access to federal resources by community-based organizations. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan to share more about that work, and then also know that that paper will be putting out, hopefully, if not this week, next week, but it's coming. Thank you, Susan.
Oh, thank you, Sasha. That was a fantastic introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. Again, I'm Susan Hartman. I'm with Enterprise Advisors. We are Enterprise Community Partners mission-based consultancy. And we did work with Spark on a memo, as Sasha just referenced, that will be distributed. And we're excited to share that with you. Next slide, please. So again, as Sasha just prefaced, and I can kind of breeze through this, community-based organizations provide critical social and economic community supports that we know are just incredibly important to ensure that resources reach community members, especially those that are the hardest to reach in communities, and to really ensure that what we need to do is really make sure that these organizations are able to be funded, because they do offer more nimble and adaptive community infrastructure than many larger organizations or for-profit organizations. However, we know that many are ineligible and often kind of not positioned strongly to be able to receive federal funding. And we know that ultimately it's limiting the impact of federal funds on low-income communities and communities of color. So really, we know that CBOs are an important component of federal shifts to advance racial equity, and with current political shifts in Washington, this is something that we really want to amplify. And in the COVID-19 crisis, the response to COVID-19 and the grassroots response needed really demonstrated how CBOs respond differently to crises, and how they provide really needed community infrastructure, and why their role is so important. We know that CBOs are important to ensuring that these funds reach BIPOC-led and smaller communities and community-based organizations that have not traditionally been part of the primary recipients of federal grants. Next slide, please. So over the last year, Enterprise Advisors researched best practices and conducted 18 interviews with small and large CBOs and medium-sized CBOs. We talked to thought leaders, we talked to former agency officials who reviewed grants and as they were coming into agencies, and we talked with subject matter experts around to get a high-level overview of really understanding how community-based organizations could increase access to federal funding, and what could be done to improve that. Some of the key issues discussed with them were the ability of smaller CBOs to access federal funds, an example of federal and effective supports and barriers to accessing funds, strategies and tactics to increase federal funding to small CBOs, and the design of programs to support CBOs that can stabilize neighborhoods. So really wide-ranging conversations. Next slide, please. As Sasha mentioned, federal funding gets into communities in a variety of ways. It can be a federal application directly to the agency distributing funds. It can be through metropolitan planning organizations, MPOs, depending on the type of project. or intermediaries. And it can also, and most often comes through states or through local governments. So states and local governments will be the way that grassroots CBOs most often access federal funds. So I want to preface it with that. And we know that federal funding flows through a number of different channels, and it often follows HUD's Community Development Block Grant allocation formulas. Not always, but often. Recent Treasury funding, including ARPA and the recovery funds, largely follow CDBG funding formulas. So becoming familiar with those is important. More recently, the Infrastructure Act, IIJA, actually uses a mix of allocation methods. And depending on the type of grant you'd be looking for, there would be a different way to apply for those grants. Sometimes they're just competitive grants. There's program funding, there's formula funding. So additional research would be needed based on your state and based on the type of project you would be looking to fund. Some federal agencies don't follow the CDBG allocation formulas. And so it's depending on the agencies you may be looking to reach out to, there may be other formulas you want to look into. So that could be Department of Education or Energy, EPA, Agriculture. Again, some additional research on your part would be useful in that for those agencies. And lastly, I just want to preface again that it's really through state and local government and local organizations will be able to access these funds. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as Sasha mentioned, there are a number of different obstacles and challenges that local CBOs face when getting federal funding. And we, in our research, found that there were systems level issues and barriers, and there were organizational barriers on the parts of CBOs. We wanted to detangle them a little bit. So at the systems level, at the very high level, we recognized and we learned that the federal preference is for larger awards to more established organizations with proven compliance capacity. And that can make it very challenging for smaller CBOs to compete successfully. And that was something that came up again and again. The timing and the release of the federal funding announcements is often opaque and requires very quick response in a very complicated application process. So the timing can be a challenge for smaller organizations. Smaller CBOs in particular are required, well, all really are required to cover costs and then wait for reimbursement, which can be a huge challenge for organizations without reserves in the ready to spend on programs. And county and local governments have their own compliance requirements from the federal government, and sometimes actually increase the compliance requirements for the organizations they fund in their own quest to avoid fraud or risk or abuse. So there can be additional hurdles that are not required by the feds, but that state and local governments sometimes can put on their grantees. So it's good to know about that. As a quick example that's on the slide, I won't read through it. The federal home program is incredibly important. It comes out of HUD, and it does tenant-based rental assistance for low and very low income households, rehabilitation and construction of housing, site acquisition, site improvements. It's an important program. And we know that current home funding requires that 100% of those funds need to be spent by 2025, or those funds will have to be returned. And that just creates a huge barrier for smaller CBOs in particular, or community land trusts and others who struggle with spending down the money. There's real concern about having to return those funds. And also they're concerned that this will affect future grant applications. So there's just a lot of concern. So systems level solutions in this case would be to advocate to spread funding over time and reduce the installments to smaller community-based organizations to make that spend down more manageable. Another point would be shifting timelines for community land trusts in particular, who are competing often with market rate developers for land acquisition. And to advocate to state agencies to award funds through a competitive process that's tailored to small CBOs. Maybe large organizations and small organizations have different processes. Those are a few points. Next slide, please. We also saw that there were organizational barriers. And so this really is on the part of the CBOs, that small staff sizes, and I saw a lot of you mentioned what were in the Mentimeter, there were biggest concerns, what were your biggest concerns? And I think this will resonate, what we heard resonated with what I saw in the Mentimeter. That small staff sizes means that complex application requirements are burdensome. Training and keeping staff abreast of not only application requirements, but also compliance needs is a challenge. Some CBOs had high staff turnover, particularly during COVID. They had additional training requirements related to staff turnover, and that budget burdens were really hard when they had to wait for reimbursement. So fronting the money to provide program needs was really challenging while waiting for reimbursement. One organization that I wanted to highlight that we spoke with, and they did a fantastic job of really pivoting during COVID, provides, they're called SICA, the Southeast Asian Community Alliance. They're located in Los Angeles, and they pivoted on a dime to be able to provide services to low and extremely low income neighborhoods in Los Angeles, over 400 households in 12 Asian languages, to be able to receive COVID funding. It's not, they weren't designed to, that wasn't their organizational design, but they switched in COVID to be able to do that. And the reason they were able, and ultimately they were running clinics that were serving 400 households and then distributing 1,200 vaccine doses. So just really able to reach very hard to reach community members. But what they did to be able to get in line for that is they joined a Section 504 federal grant pool administered by an enterprise. They joined in 2019, which provided funding that funded training, technical assistance, and capacity building to support their engagement in programs and their ability to get in line for funding. They shifted their internal processes to meet federal requirements, which increased their access to additional funds as they became available. And then they were able to hire administrative staff. They grew from maybe a staff of 2 or 3. They hired administrative staff to be able to manage those grants and be able to support program expansions. So this is how they were able to pivot on that. Next slide, please. So a few insights from the field. Applying successfully for federal funding takes time and effort, but it offers an opportunity to ensure that resources reach communities. So stick with it and keep trying. I think a critical piece that came out of our research was that failure to win is a disappointment, but it's an incredibly valuable opportunity for organizations to learn how to be successful in the future. So we recommend that you request a debrief with the application reviewer, if you can. Ask questions, learn how your application can be approved and be more competitive in the next round. And then keep up advocacy with your peers and others and highlight systemic issues that make it harder for CBOs to win and manage federal awards. Keeping an eye on my time here, I'm going to kind of run through the next few slides at a high level, and I know they'll be provided to you afterwards, and look forward to any questions that you may have. Next slide, please. 2 slides. There we go. All right, so a few high points here. To improve, we recommend some high-level recommendations to improve information sharing between the federal governments and directly to get that information from the feds to CBOs. So there are a number of actions here that we think could be important to help you all know when federal funding is available. Primarily, and I think this cuts across a number of our recommendations, is organize peer-to-peer exchange networks, not unlike Spark. Mentorship and information sharing opportunities about upcoming federal funding opportunities and compliance strategies. Again, learn from one another. Not only does that help with information sharing, but also to amplify advocacy in support of smaller CBOs. Reach out to intermediaries. Enterprise is one. There are others. Community foundations, local coalitions, nonprofit advocacy groups, for assistance in preparing applications and then understanding the operational changes that would be needed to ensure compliance. So really reach out for assistance. And then also to have designated staff members who can regularly scan federal award announcements. Again, they tend to come up at the last minute and require a lot of application support. So the more time you have, the more the easier it'll be to get in line for them. Next slide, please. Another recommendation is to create or partner with a regional entity that can provide supportive infrastructure. So again, this gets back to that notion of developing strong partnerships and peer-to-peer learning networks. Find a regional entity that can help with application support, legal review, finance and administrative needs, and other tasks related to requirements that come with federal funding. Regional entities exist in many places, but not in all. So in some cases that may, again, be a more grassroots effort to pull together and to be able to support the development or the creation of a regional advocacy group that can support that work. I would say one of the key things that came out of our research was actually that organizations that were able to successfully apply conducted in advance of their applications, they conducted an internal review about their operations and their administrative procedures and what they would need to do to shift their procedures in order to ensure compliance with federal grant reporting. And that was something that they thought not only helps them when they did receive grants in the end, but also helped them position themselves for additional funding. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another recommendation is to balance, to advocate, this is more of an advocacy component, again, systems level change, is balancing regulatory requirements and oversight to match the size of federal funding. So again, partnering with peer organizations and intermediaries to collectively advocate for changes in the federal grant making and to streamline how those monies come out. Develop internal programs and work together to do that to reduce the risk exposure related to submitting reimbursement requests to federal grantors, and then to develop strategic plan and interim program review processes that can help prepare for and mitigate burdens associated with short award timelines. Next slide, please. And lastly, really to prioritize funding to smaller CBOs to really make an impact on local communities and to increase local capacity building. It's important to partner with, again, I can't stress this enough, partner with intermediaries and peer organizations to increase advocacy, form local or topical associations that can amplify advocacy and increase access to funding. One example is the Choto Association of Puerto Rico. And then advocate for federal grant differentiation between large and small CBOs when designing and evaluating applications. And again, these are system level changes, but I think there's an opportunity for many voices to start to make change in this arena. I went a little over my time there, and I'd like to open it up. I think we have a couple minutes for some questions.
Yes, we have a couple minutes for questions, and I can just read them off. So the first one was about the Section 504 federal grant pool. So what is Section 504?
Section 504 is federal funding to support community-based organization and nonprofit capacity building. And so that would be organizations like Enterprise Community Partners who receive Section 504 grant funding from the federal. We're an intermediary organization. And then we distribute those funds to local nonprofit community groups to be able to build their capacity to then lead as an organization, to then lead work on the ground. So Enterprise is an example of one. There are others. I think NALCAB is another one, the National Association of Latino Community Asset Builders. And there are a few others. So I would recommend reaching out to local intermediaries.
Right. I'm going to probably maybe just offer one clarification. I think it's probably Section 4.
Sorry, Section 4.
Yes, I feel that. I think that's what the confusion is. It's Section 4, and it's through HUD.
I appreciate that.
No problem. We were wondering. Okay, so the other question that I see in here is just a clarification on what you mean by regional entities.
Sure. So in our report, and I would like to direct you there, I'm sorry to do that. We did have organizations that we spoke with that said they received, I'm thinking one was in the Appalachian region. There was a regional entity that had federal funding to support the development of local capacity, the local groups, to be able to increase their own programs and operational needs to be able to grow their work, in this case, in a workforce development capacity. So again, that came through, I believe it was the Appalachian Regional Council Commission, to be able to have federal funds to support local community organizations.
Thank you. All right, one last question, and I'm going to turn it over to Melissa. So what role have you seen CDFIs play in getting federal dollars into community or providing bridge financing, hopefully at low or no interest for cash flow on reimbursables?
So I think that's really where developing a relationship with your locals, the CDFIs can streamline funding to local community organizations and to ensure and to provide more favorable lending criteria to the organizations who can then who may not qualify for more traditional funding. So again, and that could be both for, but largely for real estate development, for other infrastructure improvements.
Thank you. So now we're going to turn it over to Melissa Jones from BARHII to give an introduction and really set us up for the local panel.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. For those of you on the West Coast with me, I'm coming to you today from Oakland, California, good afternoon to everybody more in the middle of the country heading towards east. I am Melissa Jones. I'm the executive director of BARHII. We are a regional organization similar to the organizations that Susan was talking about. We're the coalition of the Bay Area's governmental public health departments. They created BARHII to focus on the issues that impact health outside of the doctor's office, with the knowledge and goal that issues of housing and housing affordability and economic justice are core to health. And so our work over the last handful of years during the pandemic has been to ensure an equitable rapid response and an equitable rolling recovery, knowing that COVID went up and down, as did a series of economic issues right along with it. We are a 10-person organization. We have received our first grant of relief funds a handful of months ago. And then we have confirmed scopes of work for other relief funds, including funds that would flow from us to subgranted partners. And that contracting process we find is taking a different amount of time from different agencies. But we expect to receive those next rounds of funds in the next couple of months. Those funds for us as a regional agency have come from our California Department of Public Health, which is funds for training and capacity support for government and communities, as well as from local government entities that have awards. So our work has been to create a two-part strategy to help really see relief funds land in the communities that need them most. This is a once-in-a-generation level of investment that's coming out at the federal level. And it will only be a once-in-a-generation level investment for those of us in community if we can know where the money is, see it, find it, and have it awarded in local communities. And we think we have a two-part strategy to make that happen. The first is to train and prepare local governments to make equitable decisions and awards. So we have been building capacity of local governments to do that. From the local government perspective, it was not always clear what was coming when. And so we did a series of trainings on what money's been approved, when you should expect to see it at the state level, when it might flow to you as a locality, if you're big enough to see an award yourself as a locality, or if your awards will mostly be coming from the state. So we help people understand and prepare that. We use lobbyists who had been hired by our local foundations, who then allowed us to use that lobbyist time and energy to share information across local governments and across community partners, so we could know what was coming. We then did presentations to advisory boards, elected officials on that same topic, and created guidebooks, which are available at no cost on our website and could be useful in many places at www.barhi.org, that you can see as the resource guides for local government to help them think about how to make equitable decisions and make it easiest to receive money. And then we did some specific guides by jurisdiction so that counties and cities could look directly at what the needs were in their local communities. And we help them identify and match the needs in their local communities to the ways that they can use their resources and funding. On the community side, we did something very similar to what Susan talked about a moment ago. So we made sure there was information out there about the funding that's available, because it feels like for us in the newspapers, it sounds like there's a lot of money out there, but it's really hard to know who the decision makers are so that you can actually get access to the resources. And so we shared a lot of that information, again, a lot through lobbyists. For many communities, your local community foundations or other health foundations will naturally employ lobbyists, and you could ask them for that information. We also then worked and helped community coalitions who wanted to, or community groups that wanted to receive relief dollars, come together in coalition and put together formal requests for local government. And we supported the network building to do that, and the case making around why that was a set of needs that should be funded, and that multiple community organizations should be funded to deliver that strategy. And then we've partnered with the groups to formally make those requests of different government partners. And so we've seen that moving forward in a handful of different ways, including sometimes local governments using some of the relief dollars they get from the federal government to free up general fund dollars to give to local groups, so that it would have less complicated reporting requirements and longer timelines for which they could spend it. And then we've also seen direct allocations to organizations. For us, this has been a racial justice effort. And so in particular, in the Bay Area, the Pacific Islander community and African-American communities have seen a real underinvestment of government funding. And so we have supported a group called Black Hat to come together around an anti-displacement process for Black communities. And then also we've supported a Pacific Islander task force of volunteer organizations across the region to have the resources they need to recover from COVID. And we've found that either having a fiscal sponsor or an anchor institution that can accept funds on behalf of the organizations has been one way to help the government entities figure out how to do the funding that they need. So that's a bit of a summary about how we've worked. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you a handful of people across the country who have been doing similar work in local communities. And so I am, each is going to do the same kind of introduction that I've done, which is a sort of brief overview of who the organization is, what size it is, to give you a sense of how it might correlate to your own organization, and what their activities have been to secure federal funding. I'm going to start in LA, head to Chicago, and then head to Memphis. So I'll pause for a moment for those introductions, and then we'll do a panel discussion.
Everyone, my name is Roberto Garcia-Ceballos. I'm here with Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra, Libre, which is a community land trust based in East LA and Boyle Heights. And I'm also here as a member of the LA CLT Coalition. And it's really important to kind of tie these two kind of formations to kind of tell you of how we've been able to work during this health and economic crisis that we're in through COVID-19. And so I have a little presentation, and I also noticed that there's colleagues here from the LA CLT Coalition, and so hope I do justice for our work. So I saw Faiza and Sandra here. And so again, I'll start with Fideicomiso. We're actually a very new organization. We were formed in 2018, and we didn't really have an infrastructure until 2021. And so mostly because it's a grassroots-led effort, we're located in a community that's been disinvested. Now it's being gentrified, and displacement is a common thread towards a lot of the issues that are happening in the neighborhood. And our members are founding members. We're really focused around creating an alternative to the housing crisis and displacement of our neighbors. Even before the pandemic, this was already a big issue, right? And so our objectives are not just only to build out the capacity of our neighborhood, but really think about a regional infrastructure of community ownership. And so just in the one year and 5 months of kind of being like turned on as in as the organization turning on and like having infrastructure and staff, we've been able to hire like 1.5 people. We've been active and during the pandemic, distributing like food for 80 families a week. Since the pandemic started, we've had an active leadership like development program, and our board members are actively involved in our organization as volunteers. And we've continued to like outreach to buildings in East LA and Boyle Heights at risk of being sold, inviting tenants to join our organization, to know about their rights, and support them with a rent relief. And we've also been able to acquire a small multifamily building of 11 units. And I'll talk more of like how we got here. But that's kind of like a little description of like who we are as Fideicomiso. Again, it's an organization that was founded by mostly women from the neighborhood, supported by local CDCs and the Legal Aid Foundation and other community land trusts in the area. And so, but it's really important to kind of give some context of what's happening in LA. And so in LA, there's an CLT emergence. So in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had 3 new community land trusts formed, including Fideicomiso. And so El Sereno Community Land Trust, Liberty Community Land Trust, and Fideicomiso, we all kind of emerged around the same time. And again, a lot of the threads around like, there's been a lot of work around anti-displacement, and specifically in like BIPOC communities, specifically like Black communities in South LA, brown communities in East LA, and even like Chinatown is like an essential core area that is like forming. It has just formed the CLT in the last like couple months. And so for us, it's really important to kind of lay that context out, because for us during the pandemic, it was essential to form the LA CLT Coalition. And the LA CLT Coalition is a coalition of member-led, BIPOC-led community land trusts in the LA region. And for us, it was around like advancing the collective capacity building of our organizations, and to really have an impact around the way we want to see housing and kind of move in like the coming years as a long-term agenda of like decommodifying land and housing. And so one of the initial things that we did was like, one, we like formed this collective of community land trusts, and then we actually started fundraising together. We started thinking about long-term policies, and we started thinking about the current crisis. And one of the biggest things is like there's federal funding coming. We know it's coming. It's coming through all the things that were just mentioned earlier, right? The CDBG, AARP, ARP. And for us, it was really important to think about like, well, how do we position community land trusts in a place where this federal funding could be used to make sure that we stabilize our communities through the acquisitions of small multifamily buildings where tenants are at high risk. One, because the unemployment was high, people were getting sick, and at the same time, like those are just communities that have been targets consistently of disinvestment. And so for us, like it was just a high priority. And so as a coalition, we've been able to fundraise $3 million in the last like 2 years solely to kind of for operating funds for our community land trust to be staffed, to be able to like function when needed, to do the work that we needed. We've been able to also to receive funding from our CDFI partners, like locally and nationally, to really move fast around acquisitions for these small multifamily buildings. And then we've also been able to set aside a lot of these funds that we've been able to fundraise around really thinking about the regional infrastructure, around what are the shared capacities that we have that we can invest together, and what joint campaigns can we work on, and what staff can we eventually share in the future, or what capacities can we share in the future, as we're thinking not solely of community land trust as like the impact it has on a local level, but really thinking about how does it build out like a regional infrastructure. And so again, I just want to kind of recap that for us, like if there was going to be any large scale like economic recovery, it really needed to attend like structural transformation of the housing market. And so for us, like we saw the role of community land trust as being like our role was to provide low and moderate income people the opportunity to build equity through home ownership. And we're thinking about co-ops, we're thinking about limited equity cooperatives, we're thinking about collective ownership of small multifamily buildings. At this point, we're not thinking about single family homes. So when we think about home ownership, it's really like thinking long-term. We want to ensure that residents are not displaced due to land speculation and gentrification. Again, like the pandemic started and we started seeing small multifamily buildings being sold at a high speed. The market was really hot while people were suffering. And it just shows how, you know, how pervasive this like housing market is. And then we want to make sure that we protect owners from the housing downturn, like market downturns. And so we want to be able to move the funds that are coming through the federal government, through the state, through the local, to really like make sure that there's like stability. And then we want to promote direct grassroots participation in decision-making and community control of local assets. So if we're going to build more affordable housing, if we're going to acquire more affordable housing, well, let's make sure that it's like democratically controlled. Let's make sure that like we're really trying to break that tenant-landlord relationship in a way where a community land trust or a housing cooperative can really help facilitate the empowerment of tenants to take control over the structures that they live in or the housing that they live in. And so again, what these are kind of some of the, so we were eventually initially looking at federal funding. And what happened is that we didn't receive any federal funding, but we were able to pass very essential policy due to the fact that we advocated for that federal funding. And so we won two really important pieces of policy at the county level. One was that we created a pilot program for the county for Chapter 8 tax foreclosures to be turned over to community land trusts. And that was like a direct investment of like, if there's going to be foreclosure, then like specifically around tax foreclosure, then we need to make sure that community land trusts can intervene during that process. The second one was that we also won a CLT like pilot program where the county used $14 million for the community land trust to acquire and rehab 4 to 20 unit buildings in high displacement risk areas. And that's where our community land trusts are located. So it was just like really key in terms of that. And so as of today, hopefully by the end of or by April, we've had acquired 8 acquisitions to finalize this pilot program. And so this is, you know, it's been really key. And so how does this work? Like, how do we acquire these buildings when, you know, you're talking to a community land trust that's only like really been active for like 3 years, right? And so for us, Roberto, we really had to build out this like big infrastructure with the support of CDCs, with the support of like CDFIs, and the support of community-based organizations. And we call it the LA Acquisition Rehab Working Group. And this specific group is really focused on making sure that there's actual infrastructure for when there is funding coming in through the state or through the county or through the city or through the federal government, that we're prepared to acquire buildings. And an example is that Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre was able to partner with a CDC partner like Little Tokyo Service Center for us to really have the capacity to acquire a building and be able to set these buildings up long-term in terms of tenant ownership. So at the moment, for a direct example is that our community land trust acquired an 11-unit building with the support of Little Tokyo Service Center and the support of another community-based organization that did a lot of the outreach and direct service work prior to acquiring the building with the tenants. At this moment, and then as we acquired the building, we also received support from Spark through a fund for us to be able to do a lot of the due diligence and get into escrow. And that was facilitated by Genesis LA. And so in a lot of ways, like we make sure that our infrastructure needs community-based organizations, it needs CLTs, and it needs CDCs to have these very like important partnerships. And so this is a graph that the group has like worked on in terms of like, what does our CLT CDC acquisition rehab program look like?
Thank you, Roberto. I wonder if we can hear from the other two groups and then come back into this as part of the Q&A.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. You know, I think the story that you're telling is such a powerful one. The network building, community organizing, grassroots work that's been happening in LA is really incredible. And the ability to pull all those pieces together, to have the operating costs that are needed, and to find which federal funds are really going to fit and support the mission, and which will be outside it has been a really powerful piece of your work. It's been very similar to the kinds of thinking that's been going into the work in Chicago. And so Chicago is going to join us now, Roberto, in Chicago, and talk to us a little bit about the way that it's played out there. And also some of the trust building that's being done between government and community in the efforts to have it be a very mission-driven, values-driven process.
Thank you, Melissa, and thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Roberto Requejo. I'm the Executive Director of Elevated Chicago. We are a coalition that launched in 2017 as a BIPOC-led group of community-based organizations and leaders, and I'm not gonna mention all of them. We have a slide showing you the diversity of our steering committee, and our coalition is comprised from neighborhoods, neighborhood-based organizations from across Chicago, and also institutional partners, including the City of Chicago Department of Public Health, 2 community development financial institutions, regional think tanks and planning organizations, and also our community foundation, the Chicago Community Trust, which acts as our house or our fiscal agent. And our community-based members are community organizers, affordable housing developers and managers, small business supporters, art-based organizations, and many, many more things. And I want to give a big shout out to all of our members in this webinar today. Our mission, our collective mission, is advancing equitable transit-oriented development, or ETOD, across the city and stop displacement and depopulation in majority BIPOC communities. And we support capital projects with funding like housing, health centers, small businesses, and community centers, and also infrastructure for walkability near transit. And in addition to bricks and mortar support, we also advocate for systems change, and we share knowledge and tell stories about ETOD in communities. In addition to having a diverse steering committee, and there's another slide that shows you also the people who are part of our governance leading our work, we also have a leadership council, and this is the next slide. And this leadership council includes the city commissioners of all the departments involved in ETOD, mayor's office representatives, also transit authorities there, our metropolitan planning organization, and also other partners. And one thing that we did was to set up this council not as an advisory, but as a place where communities can interact directly with these leaders, and where these leaders listen and respond to community needs. And then our governance structure for Elevated, which is the next slide, is a flat structure and works as a set of interconnected tables with our steering committee and the staff at the center, and a number of working groups and community tables convened by our members and assisting and informing our collective work together. So I'm telling you all this just to say that the public sector, both the city and the Metropolitan Planning Organization, sat at our table from the very, very beginning, and we, Elevated, have not been a direct recipient of government funds yet, but we have helped our partners access these dollars, and we have also asked government to align about $500,000 of government funding every year to support our work plan. And we call that our aligned funding, and it resides inside the city or inside our CDFIs or in the Metropolitan Planning Organization's budget. I'm saying this because sometimes it's more strategic to have those dollars parked there, but in service of your work, than having to absorb all that yourself. Some examples of the work that our partners have done with federal funding include using Section 4 funds from HUD through enterprise community partners to pay for pre-development of ETOD projects in their communities. Another example is our Metropolitan Planning Organization, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP, who's here today in the webinar. Thanks for joining. Is funding ETOD action planning in 2 of the communities that we serve, in Logan Square and in Washington Park. And our Department of Public Health has also set aside funding for walkability studies and improvements near the train stations where we work. And so there are 3 main roles that we have played with government to help them create their ETOD agenda for the past 5 years. And those 3 main roles are roles that we keep in mind and are going to continue guiding our work as we support government in deploying the ARPA allocations. First role is that we're having a thought partner, helping plan initiatives around ETOD. Second role, we have been an implementation partner, making sure that plans actually happen and are not just promises made to communities that get not done. And third role, we have been an accountability partner, just keeping our colleagues in government accountable to the promises they make to communities. We play these 3 roles with 2 mayoral administrations, first with Mayor Emanuel's and now with Mayor Lloyd Lightfoot's. And so trust between communities and government took, first of all, time, and second of all, real demonstration of partnership on the side of government. And this next slide here gives you a sense of the timeline from our foundation in 2017 to the recent ARPA allocations for ETOD that with the advocacy from our entire community have generated $800 million investment in housing and additional dollars for ETOD, in addition to that housing located near transit. And I think we'll have time later to talk more about this journey in the presentation. Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong. So I'm going to stop here and let my colleague Mia to go next.
Thank you, Roberto. So now we've heard from LA and from a group on their way to federal funds. That's a newer group in its development. And from Roberto, which is a group with an 8-year history that used it to pull in a federal focus on ETOD. And now we get to hear from Ms. Mia Madison out of Greater Memphis. She's going to share what the landscape looks like for attracting federal funds in Memphis right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to my colleagues and to Spark for allowing me to be here today. I hail you all from Memphis, Tennessee. My name is Mia Madison. I am the Executive Director of Memphis Tilth. Here at Memphis Tilth, we are a pretty niche nonprofit. We are an agricultural nonprofit. Our mission is to lead agricultural initiatives focused on land, people, and place, where we cultivate collective action for an economically sustainable, socially equitable, environmentally sound local food system. And so we are a 501c3 in that we are approved by the IRS to receive federal funds. We established in 2016, and here you can see on the slide how we formed. It was 5 organizations that actually came together to stop competing for funding against one another. So Grow Memphis, Urban Farms, the Center for Food and Faith, and an institutional partnership with St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, along with Bring It Food Hub, the Chelsea Avenue Farmers Market, and then becoming a partner with the Center for Transforming Communities, who is the Spark partner here in Memphis, Tennessee. My slide's not advancing. Give me 1 second. So the key ingredients to our mission: land, food, people, and place. And I'll try to move through these slides pretty quickly, because here at Memphis Tilth, we believe that if you free the land, you free the people. And so we believe that land begins with soil. And some of our work has specifically been working with communities on how to address soil contamination. Memphis Tilth and the Neighborhood Collaborative for Resilience worked specifically to develop a bioremediation pilot project that looked at contamination in the North Memphis area using a lens from a mycoremediation and phytoremediation technique, which uses mushroom spores and sunflowers in order to address soil contamination. As a part of our partnership with the North Memphis community, becoming a partner with the Center for Transforming Communities, the Just Change Alliance, focusing on climate and environment, really worked to address climate equity and what that meant using a racial lens in a predominantly African-American community. So we began to look at vacant lots and how regreening of that area could actually be done with ideas from the community. So currently there is a project underway to regreen North Memphis and to use a Soil Your Undies project that was born out of the USDA to record microbial activity at the soil level so that we can understand what's happening beneath our feet in our communities that are disinvested from deindustrialization. And also what I would always like to say is planned shrinkage. And so here are some of the spaces by which we utilize agricultural techniques in order to develop communities. We have community gardens in North Memphis, South Memphis. We grow in partnership with the St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, but our territory for one of our programs, Bring It Food Hub, covers a 150-mile radius where we partner with farms to aggregate and distribute food. And so we also do ag education. And so that's a 5-week course where we partner with community members and farmers growers who are interested in addressing soil conditions in their area. Because food is the great equalizer, right? It provides a universal joy. And so here is a quote by Michael Chiarello, who, really remembers his mother's cooking, and that food and people, you can love people through food. And so Bring It Food Hub, one of our programs, is an aggregated distributor of produce we aggregate food from farms within 150 miles, and then we distribute that over a 40-week period in a year, providing seasonal produce to members. And so we're not really a hobby farm, we actually grow for production. And so we teach community members how to create sustainable food sources in their neighborhoods. So instead of having processed food in the community, you have a living food pantry right at your doorstep. And so here are some of the things that we grow. We also work with food makers and manufacturers in our commercial kitchen to develop products. And so Ziamato Gelato, who is our resident food manufacturer, we work specifically with them in accessing resources from the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, especially around food safety measures, so that they can get their products to market. And so we never underestimate the power of a small group committed to change the world. And I think that's what everyone here on this call is doing today. But our small group consists of 7 staff, 4 interns. Our board of directors are a number of 6. We have about 200 volunteers that we utilize in our spaces. We have maybe 400 members and subscribers to our Bring It Food Hub program, a number of partners, and over 40 different producers and farmers that we rotate through our programs. And so here are some of those people that we are engaged with in our region. And so we also do We also provide a fellowship so that those who are interested in the food system can actually work in it in specific areas. We partner with other organizations like Clean Memphis, 901 Save the Food, Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, in order to provide opportunities to those who are emerging up through the food system so that they can make that impact. And here are some of our volunteers.
Can I ask you a question that's coming in over the line?
Yeah, sure.
So people are asking about a tool or strategy that you think is useful for people in terms of applying for the federal funds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If I can, let me stop sharing my slide and go to something else that I want to hear. Because those comments that you're asking me, Melissa, you know, what can people do to actually access funding in their community? And my comments really are for those smaller, mid-sized nonprofits who may be less than $500,000, right? So one of the things that we must ensure when we're thinking about accessing funding from the federal government is that we have specific things in place, like our 501c3. That nonprofit status is going to be really important. Depending on where you're located, your state solicitation letter actually says that you're ready to receive funding, not just from the federal government, but also from your local philanthropic funders. And so a set of financials is actually going to be important. But if you haven't had the opportunity to file a 990, then a summary of financial activities would be really important. A program narrative and a budget. And when you're thinking about that program narrative, your inputs, your outputs, and those outcomes are going to be how you can describe what it is that you're doing on the ground. And so when you're thinking about getting into relationship with the federal government, you can't do any of that. None of that even really matters if you don't have a DUNS number. And so registering with sam.gov is actually the first place to start, along with partnering with your state's business office, the Secretary of State, and the Department of Revenue in your state is actually going to have a lot of information that can help you get off the ground. I know we're pressed for time, and I want to pause there because I'd love to open it up for questions, and I can share some of what those local tools are in Memphis to help people actually get started if they haven't acquired all of those steps.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's bring all the panelists back onto the screen. The same question for one more of you. You choose. And then I think that the Spark national partners are going to help facilitate the rest of the questions that are in the chat. But what is the tool or strategy that you think is going to be most helpful for people considering applications for federal funds, either if it's flowing through a local entity or through the feds directly?
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, I think most community-based organizations, especially who are on the ground in communities, really start with demonstration because they feel like they know the work themselves. They can be in community and maybe struggle with how to turn that into a narrative that they can then tell somebody, you know, what they're doing. But as a nonprofit or as a community-based organization, when you're meeting with strategic partners or funders, if you don't give them something to walk away with, they're not going to remember what it is that you're doing in that community, because many times they don't come into those communities to see the thing that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Any other thoughts, or should we go straight to the questions?
I was just going to say that in our case, we don't have like a magic, strategy or magic bullet to kind of attract funding. But what has worked in our case in Libre, Chicago has been to establish deep and long-term relationships with the government agencies, and this is very hard and long-term kind of work. If you think about the journey that I showed earlier before, the city and Elevated partnered for 18 months to create an ETOD policy plan and an ETOD working group. And during those 18 months, a lot happened with a pandemic going on, a change in mayors, and that was an opportunity to build trust together, right? The working group grew to 20 plus organizations. Meetings were held consistently, even during the pandemic. And when they turned to us for help, we ensured that we were providing people creative ways to engage community remotely, and more than 80 organizations ended up contributing to create the city's ETOD plan. We helped the city with the public comment period too, so we became a partner in changing from a pretty boring and non-conducive public comment to one that was in social media with thousands of people contributing. And I think because we sat with them at the same table and kept having the difficult conversations and having sometimes breakdowns in communication and solving those, we were able then to collect the wins from last year from the initial $10.2 million that they set aside from ARP for ETOD to our Department of Housing announcing $1 billion from ARP funding, of which 800 were put towards ETOD. And three things that I could mention that have been super helpful and have come not just from Elevated, but from the push from all the community-based organizations and nonprofit sector to government has been the city, the county, and the state of Illinois have co-convened a full-day readiness summit to inform people on how to get ready to access federal recovery funds with a focus on CBOs. The second thing that they did is they announced an innovative program to advance up to 20% of cash, 20% of the awards in cash to community-based organizations, nonprofits, and small businesses with financial hardship. And third, they promised to set up a series of trainings and back office supports to help CBOs focus on the work rather than on auditing and reporting. So I'm really excited about all this, but again, what I wanted to convey here is that it took a significant amount of time, and also sitting with government and spending a lot of quality time with the city, with the different departments, with the Transit Authority, with the Metropolitan Planning Organization, creating those, rebuilding some of the trust that was never there.
Thank you. Yeah. And so I'm hearing two kinds of thinking about the ways to prepare and position for the federal funds, both in your comments earlier and then in both of your responses now. One is about having government know the kinds of initiatives you've been moving forward, the ways that you've been doing it with takeaways, like Mia said, so that they can remember after you've left all the work that you've been doing, and to be in building that relationship. And then the second is the organizational pieces that Mia and Susan talked about around the 501c3 or having a fiscal sponsor who can help in this time. And then the preparing of a narrative, the preparing of all the documents, which also people can hire consultants to do. And sometimes local foundations who are interested in seeing more equity in government funding will pay for you to have those consultants present. Roberto, in LA, do you have other thoughts?
No, I mean, I think, I think through a very grassroots perspective, I think it is around the partnerships that are developed, and I think it's not just any partnership. I think there's many at least for CLTs, there's a lot of CDCs that we could have worked with, but we didn't, because I think there is a lack of alignment and lack of collective vision around how applying for these funds are also going to be transformative around the structural changes that we want. And that includes elected officials too. And I think that makes our it makes our journey really long. And so to think about the LA CLT Coalition and the work that it does with the Acquisition Rehab Group, it doesn't do justice that we look at it in the last 2 to 3 years. I think it's a buildup of 10 plus years of people really kind of planting the seeds and really being, pushing forward community land trust, equitable development in a place where we're able to now see that there's the affordable housing needs to change and not just change like locally, but in terms of like how it's funded, how CDFIs relate to our funders, or how our funders treat our CDFIs. So then like the outcomes of what we get in terms of how federal funding looks like or philanthropy looks like. So in a lot of ways, like it is all that. And I think it's like also like value-based alignment around the work that we want to be doing.
Yeah, and I really heard that from all of you, that there's a set of partners you've had for a long time that are aligned to your values. And there's a set of partners that are an outer set of partners that you know about and can feel the lack of alignment. And so the question is for the circle that is tied in, that are the partners that you really want to work with, how do those networks move into having access to federal funds? And when is it useful and when is it not, right? With like partnerships with any funder. You know, the issues of timeline are a big one. I think sometimes in the paper, it sounded like there's all this money, it's coming in really fast. That's definitely the perspective of government, that there's a lot to give out and that they don't necessarily have the staffing or contracting capacity to do it. And so people can start to feel, I think, pressed by that. But the truth is there's a lot of money coming out over an extended timeline. So there were relief dollars that came out first, that came out on kind of faster timelines. And then there was the American Recovery Act that's coming out over a 2-year period to be spent. And it may seem like, well, if it's only 2 years, it must already be allocated. But increasingly what we're hearing is there's still governments trying to figure out what they're going to do with their resources. And so there's still a moment to talk to government about that. And then there's this big infrastructure package that's coming. And that's going to have longer timelines yet. It's further out. And so there really are a lot of opportunities to think not just about the current work, but the work, as Roberto said, that's been building over years, and how funding might support those different pieces. So let's, Sasha is helping me look in the questions and answers to see what other questions are coming up.
Yep. Yeah. We have a few questions. So I'm going to go with how do we convince our local foundations that's worthy of investing in pairing with CBO with consultants to help with the process? So there's a lot of resistance with local family foundations in changing their status quo where they're located.
Oftentimes foundations are interested in what other foundations are doing, and often they have their favorites that they're interested in knowing what their favorites are doing. And so it can be good to talk to your community partners in other places who have foundations who are helping them, and ask them to make broker a relationship with their foundations, so that they can talk to each other. That might be one way to do it. Do other people have other thoughts?
Go ahead, Mia.
Sometimes those things don't change, right? When we're in community, we know our people, we know sometimes what we believe is the status quo may not necessarily be what the community foundation actually feels. The community foundation in various cities are actually a group of individual funds that are really just providing information to those family of funds that they're managing those assets for. So having a relationship with the foundation means, you know, that's the first step. Figure out a way to have the relationship with the foundation so that they can champion you to those foundations, and then provide them with the information that's necessary for them to be able to describe what it is that you're doing. Invite them to come and participate in some of the activities that you have in your community, and they then become your champions at the funding table.
Thank you.
I think just to add to that, I think I'm learning this through like some of the folks who I've like had the privilege to work with like during this period of time. But I think it's also like understanding like conditions, and then understanding crisis, and how crisis also like creates openings that are very essential in terms of like being able to approach philanthropy or foundations in ways that are bold and that like, and that are kind of like, that you just like go for it in moments, like knowing like how to pivot the crisis for it to benefit like the communities that we work for. And I'm like, that's something I'm learning now, but that I've seen done like multiple times now during like the last 3 years of being like, okay, like this is actually an opening, and this is time, like it's time to organize foundations in the way that it's been described, right? Of like, being able to get one big foundation and then being able to jump on the other one, because they're connected to each other. And at the same time, like, I think breaking the individuality of like fundraising. And so for the LACLT coalition, it's been essential that 5 organizations fundraise together. And not only like fundraise, but really think about the shared resources that we're going to have together. And then also like, what are the roles and capacities that we're going to offer each other as we're thinking about building a sustainable infrastructure, and not just like a one-time fundraising opportunity.
Thank you.
I think we're coming up on time, and yes, I think Sasha just named. We're gonna turn to Rio and share her screen so she can walk us through the illustration. Please continue sharing questions in the chat. We will collect them and we will try to get a response out with the recording. So I'll go ahead and move over to you, Rio.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Rio Holiday. I'm here as your graphic recorder, and my background is in community-based organizations, and part of the reason I was asked here was to listen for things that I might be noting in the role of a community-based organization. And so very quickly, to walk you through, we started with the context that yes, the funding ecosystem is not set up to support community-based organizations, and we're sitting with the complexity that it both needs transformation and there are opportunities for CBOs to get funding now. There was a train that we were walked through where there were systems and organizational barriers. There is a report with some solutions and ideas that we will have access to later. And ideally, the outcome is that community-based organizations can ensure federal funding reaches the community. On the panel, just a few themes that were coming up were first the partnerships and coalitions, both between CBOs, between CBOs and local government, as well as philanthropy, training and preparing local governments, as well as community-based organizations to receive these funds, to know what is already happening, and the trust that is required to be built between partners and local governments, how it takes time, how there are multiple roles that we can play in order to build that trust. Down at the bottom, there's more themes around capacity and funding and positioning. One of the things that came up was where the funding goes. And someone said, sometimes it's more strategic for funding to sit elsewhere and support your work. That is also in line with the idea of sharing resources when we think about capacity building. Lots of materials that were recommended, as well as understanding the decision-making landscape and who your champions can be. That was a very fast recap, and I will pass it back to the facilitator.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think Ella's going to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much. I really want to thank our speakers. Okay, great. I had my video off there for a second. I really want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Sasha, Melissa, Roberto from LA, from Chicago, Susan from Enterprise, Mia, and we are so lucky to have these site partners and be doing this work. And part of the pieces that they have shared are also the things that they are working through. So we're really grateful for our time with them. As part of a follow-up, we'll go ahead and share out the beautiful images that Rio created, along with her contact information if you'd like to work with her. We would also be able to share some of the recording, as well as some of the responses to some of these questions. And of course, the slide deck, especially if you want a chance to see me with beautiful slides. So please feel free. We'll be sharing other Spark webinars, and be sure to look at the webinar before this if you're interested in more of this topic. So a huge thank you, and thank you also to Jasmine Gargoum for helping us in the facilitation process and leading this.